Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and in the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and also the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. And today is particularly interesting to discuss brain injuries in sports, concussions. And I think we've all heard about it. We've all seen it. Have had family members suffering from concussion. It's a terrible thing. But let's hear from people in the field. We will be joined by Ken Dryden and sport broadcaster Arash Madani and our very own junior fellow and concussion researcher Sandhya Mylabathula. But first also, let me pass it to the moderator, the great Steve Paikin, who's a member of the Quadrangle Society of Massey College. Stephen.
Natalie, the great Steve Paikin? Come on. Not even my parents would second that. Anyway, so glad everybody could dial us up and join us tonight. I think we're all coming from our respective virtual locations, of course, in these COVID times. And I'm going to just a little more thoroughly introduce the three people who've got who care a great deal about this subject and know a great deal about this subject and are going to share their views on it tonight. We'll chat amongst ourselves for the first half hour, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll be happy to take those of you who want to ask questions. We'll take your questions at that point. We're happy to welcome Ken Dryden to tonight's discussion. You all know Ken, Hockey Hall of Famer, Stanley Cup champion, former federal cabinet minister, and the guy who was in the net and on the ice when Henderson scored for Canada in the immortal 1972 Summit Series. Arash Madani is here. Arash is one of the most thoughtful and prominent voices in sports journalism in the country today. He plies that as a national reporter for Rogers Sportsnet. And I've had the great pleasure as a quadrangler to actually, Sandhya, I don't think we've ever met, but we have certainly Zoomed probably a half a dozen times over the past year. I'm, I guess, your mentor, and you are my mentee. Sandhya Mylabathula, junior fellow at Massey College, and someone who has spent a great deal of time doing research on brain injuries, both inside and outside sports, and was actually on an episode of The Agenda on TVO about this not too long ago, maybe a couple of months ago. And Sandhya, it's good to see you again, and I hope one of these days we actually get to bump elbows or whatever one does now that shaking hands is illegal. Okay, Ken Dryden, start us off. I want to start with a very recent development because there is a very big, strong, talented, popular player for the Washington Capitals by the name of Tom Wilson. His teammates love him. The fans in Washington love him. And he recently got suspended for 7 games for doing something that was quite damaging to another player. Why don't we start with having you describe what it is that he did?
Well, I'm just trying to remember it exactly, but you know, the puck was going into the Boston Bruins zone, and he was pursuing it, and in a very normal way. And a Bruins defenseman named Brandon Carlo was going after it, and everything seemed quite normal right up to the last moment. That Tom Wilson was doing his job, doing what he needed to do, pursuing the puck, looking to try to gain possession of the puck, to try to make an offensive play. And then at the last minute, and without any strategic benefit in doing it, he crushed Brandon Carlo's head up against the glass. And Carlo went down. And he was eventually helped off the ice, and I think he's still out. I mean I'm not sure. I know as of a few days ago he was, whether he's back playing now or not. But Tom Wilson has a history of making plays like that, and what's really too bad and quite unnecessary is that that he may have started as a big, strong, tough player, but he is also a talented player, and he can do a lot of things on the ice, and he makes lots of contributions to his team, and more all the time, and in ways where He's popular for all kinds of reasons, but what he's done several times now is that he has significantly injured an opponent, and where suspensions of whatever order that he gets, do some damage to him. But the question is that what's the damage that is done to Brandon Carlo and to others that he has injured along the way? Brain injuries are not fun. They have significant potential consequences. They have significant immediate consequences and the potential of significantly greater consequences over time. And that is no mystery. That is there to be seen for quite some time, and has absolutely been clear for the last number of years that a hit to the head is not a good thing. And really hard hits to the head and many hits to the head are not good things. And that's the most recent incident in this.
Let me jump in with this follow-up. Does a 7-game suspension suggest that the quote-unquote hockey people who run the NHL care enough about what happened to Brandon Carlo?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and I think the whole process of it is one that is there that really is, where the penalty, so far as the league is concerned, the penalty that is issued means that it is to the player who is the offender, and therefore you have to make sure that justice is done for that defender, for that that perpetrator, and so there is that process, the review of what happened. The NHL puts out these video judgments, and they're really interesting to watch, and they're very well done, and where you will see the incident from several different angles. The voiceover talks about what the rules are and whether this rule applies or how it doesn't apply, and some other rule applies instead. And then at the end, the judgment will be issued. But and when there's a significant potential penalty, then the player has the right, the offending player has the right to an in-person meeting with the league, and essentially to kind of hear his side of the story. And as I pointed out in an article that I wrote recently, what about the person who's hurt? What about having an in-person with that person? Why not, George Peros, who's the head of the NHL safety part, or Gary Bettman, why don't they have Brandon Carlo into the office? Why don't they ask him about what it is like to suffer a concussion? What is the day and that night feel like? What does the next morning feel like? What does it feel like to their wife, their partner, their parents, their friends, their kids? What does it feel like to them? What about 5 days after? What about 10 days after? What about that when they recover and they're back playing? What about the consequences after that? What about 10 years later, 15 years later? What about when their next contract is up and they're a free agent, and maybe as Tom Wilson, maybe he's a $5 million or $6 million hockey player, or Brandon Carlo is that. That are those teams that are competing for Brandon Carlo, do they have in mind that he suffered a significant concussion, a significant brain injury? Is it worth the risk of signing him? Well, maybe they'll go as high as 6 million, but they won't go to 7 or to 8. Maybe they'll go for 3 years, but they won't go for 5. There are consequences, significant consequences, for the person who has received the injury. Why isn't the focus there?
And one more before we get the others in as well. If you are right, and The National Hockey League doesn't seem to care as much as you do about what happens to Brandon Carlo. Why do you think that is?
I think that what happens, at least a significant part of it, is that the issue shifts quickly to two things. One is, again, making sure that the person who has, who is the offender is treated in a fair and just way. I think that's one part of it. And I think the other part of it is that very quickly the discussion goes into, well, is it a hockey play? Was there a targeting of the head? Was it purposeful? Did the other player have his head down a little bit? Should the other player have been more aware? And isn't this just the game and how the game is played? And the point that I make to all of that, is that, when you look on the ice, there are, essentially, I guess, maybe 18 skaters on each team for each game. How often and how many players deliver the kind of headshots, even remotely, like Tom Wilson does? How often do you see Sidney Crosby or Connor McDavid or Nathan McKinnon, or again and again? And it's not just the top 20 players. Go to the next 50. Go to the next 100. Go to the next 200, 300, 400 players. Almost none of them are engaged in the stupid stuff. And yet we say that those who deliver the stupid stuff, it's just the game. What is the game that these other players are playing if it's, if they're not playing the game?
Sandhya, I want to bring you in because I'm not going to operate under the assumption that everybody watching this knows exactly what happens to the brain when it concusses against the skull. You've been doing a lot of research on this. Why don't you tell us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. First, I just want to also say thanks for your very kind comments. It would be wonderful to meet you in person someday, and thank you so much for your mentorship thus far. But I wanted to also point out that a concussion is a brain injury. It can be a serious injury. It's a brain injury. And what happens is there is a disturbance to the brain function that's a transient disturbance, but it can have longer-term effects, potentially longer than so 1 in 5 people will see longer-term effects beyond the potential 4 weeks or so that you'll see with a concussion in terms of recovery. And the brain itself, I have a Jello brain here, the actual consistency is like that of Jello. And so we can see that it's actually quite important to protect our brains because they're really quite fragile. And I wanted to also say that I very much agree with what Ken was saying in terms of the consequences that we see with concussions, where we need to see strict consequences and consistent consequences if we're going to see any change in behavior there as well.
I found, and we talked about this a bit on the agenda when you were on a couple of months ago, you got to this issue in a way because of a hit that you saw Paul Kariya take, which very much changed the trajectory of his career. Talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, so I got into the field because of my passion for hockey as the one piece there. And one of the things was seeing Paul Kariya being affected by concussions, because as Ken was saying, it affects the individual so deeply. I think sometimes we have a bit of a distance between looking at a person as an athlete versus looking at them as a human being. And somebody like Paul Kariya will have, the rest of his life beyond his career to live. And having those types of injuries can affect somebody so deeply. Something like a shoulder injury can be very terrible, but you can replace a shoulder potentially, but you can't replace your brain. It's so important to take care of your brain. And I think it comes down to every player on the ice or the field, whatever sport we're playing, to respect their bodies, but also the bodies of their opponents.
Arash, let me get you in on this now. You cover this stuff. Do you believe that the quote unquote hockey people who are in charge of this game care enough about this issue?
No, they don't. And hockey's not alone. I mean, I got a couple of football helmets behind me. The business of the sport, the business of the game does not care about the player at all. Players are effectively, to management and to leagues, they're cattle. They're, the moment a professional player who was drafted into the NFL once told me in his introductory meeting as a rookie, he was told, "Congratulations, you've reached the NFL. We are now actively trying to replace you." That is the message. The message that a general manager has told me before. He said, "You know what the difference between an injured player and a crappy player is? Nothing. Neither are of any use to me." So that's the thought process behind this, is that, if somebody gets injured, if somebody is a contract holdout, if somebody can't play, the mantra is next man up when it comes to professional sports. Now, Ken was talking about the process of discipline. To me, the leagues are mainly responsible for this, but Brandon Carlo's Players Association and his union has also let him down, because the Players Association is protecting Tom Wilson and Tom Wilson's rights more than the actual injured player. The NHL operates penalizing the consequence of an action more than the actual action itself. And when you look around at what happens, we're not talking about contact sports here. These are collision sports. A linebacker coming off the edge, unabated to the quarterback, sacking him is the equivalent, depending on how big and strong and fast that backer is, it would be driving approximately 50 kilometers an hour into a brick wall. Now, that quarterback, after being sacked on the blindside blitz, has to, within 40 seconds, not only absorb the hit, get up, get the play call into their helmet, bark it into the huddle, go snap the ball, and continue to play. When we saw the Jello brain there, it's the repetitive blows over and over and over again. And my biggest issue with concussions is calling it a concussion. When a baseball pitcher, Steve, when they have to go for Tommy John, they say there is damage to the elbow ligament. It is damage to the brain. A concussion is actually brain damage and brain injury, but nobody wants to call it that, because nobody wants to kind of peek behind the curtain and see how the sausage is made. And that's the scary reality of collision sports.
Arash, I don't mean this follow-up to sound naive, but the players are the game. The players are the prime asset of the game. If you don't have healthy players, you have no game. So how is it that owners can seem to regard their chief asset in such a cavalier fashion?
It's supply and demand, Steve. There is a reason why professional leagues market their stars. There are a few reasons for it. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers just won the Super Bowl. Everybody knows Tom Brady. I have a hard time believing that while there were, across North America, 150 million people watching, they could name more than 3 or 4 players on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The other 50, they're here today, gone tomorrow. They are replaceable. They'll find somebody who is younger and faster and cheaper next year. In a few weeks, they're going to have a draft. They're going to bring in 280 new players. There are going to be a number of free agents. And if you can't perform for me right now, today, we'll go find somebody who can. So if I'm one of those middle-of-the-road roster players, if I'm a backup, if I'm a special teamer, if I'm a fourth liner, and I'm feeling the effects of a concussion, so much of what brain injuries are about are self-reporting. Am I going to go report that, knowing that I may be the first out the door because they're going to bring somebody else in to replace me?
But Ken, presumably this attitude comes from a place which cares about certainly the financial health of the game. And the NHL owners do not want to do anything that would adversely affect the financial health of the game. Does it therefore follow that they are as concerned about this issue as the average fan is, and maybe the average fan is just not that seized of this issue?
I think the average fan is much more seized of it because they experience it through their own kids. They may experience it to some extent themselves, through their friends. I think they get it now. I think the part that I would disagree with Arash on is that I would agree in terms of the Players Association that is remarkably silent in all of this. I mean, remarkably silent. Right from the beginning. I mean, one of the ones that I found really amazing was when with Todd Bertuzzi and Steve Moore. And so the big question at that particular moment, or at least it seemed to me it was, is that what side are the players going to fall on? What side are is the Players Association going to fall on? They're both members. They're both players. Where will the sympathies lie? Where will the understanding lie? And it was almost universal that from the Players Association and from the players, it was towards Todd Bertuzzi. That's where the sympathies lay. And I think essentially because every player could imagine themselves losing it the way Todd Bertuzzi did. And every player couldn't imagine quite to the same extent being Steve Moore. And in imagining themselves as Todd Bertuzzi, they couldn't imagine themselves being charged, potentially being becoming a criminal. That whatever they understood themselves to be on the ice, it certainly was not that. And so they could identify with Bertuzzi, and they weren't identifying with Steve Moore. But I think that where I would disagree with Arash is that the way in which at least I heard him put it, it was like it was a kind of sort of throw up your hands that that this is inevitable. I mean, this is it's in the nature of these particular games that stuff like this happens, and it's in the nature of ownership of and administration of leagues that it's one guy out, another guy in, and it's no big deal. I don't think so, and I think that I think that the key in that is that there are answers to the worst part of this problem, and it's what I tried to get at in stuff that I've written and so on. Is that start with hits to the head. That everything that happens on the ice is not wrong. That the vast majority of what goes on in the ice is terrific. And it involves people moving at incredible speeds and colliding with each other, and in ways that that sometimes are not predictable, and therefore you can't really get yourself ready for it. But the head has always been understood in hockey to be off limits. That's why the elbowing penalty was created 100 years ago, or whenever it was created. You don't elbow somebody's shoulder, you elbow their head. The head was understood as being vulnerable. Elbow, a penalty. A high stick, same thing. You don't high stick somebody's waist. You recognize the different vulnerabilities, the different potential consequences, and you focus, on that. And that's, that what the NHL, all that they need to do to a significant extent, you can always do more as you move on, is just say, a hit to the head is, that whether it was intended or not, or this or that, no, it's a hit to the head. That's a penalty. It's what the NHL has done in the last 10 years on two, types of infractions that aren't risky to anybody. You shoot the puck over the glass, when you're in your defensive zone, automatic penalty, no debate, no discussion. Player just goes to the box, no big deal. Same thing with a stick to somebody's face, automatically a penalty. If the player's cut, a double minor, or worse than that. again, when it first came
They
out,
allow fighting. They still allow fighting. They do not care about the health of the player because they know that is going to be what's going to be on highlight shows. They know that's going to be what's going to get people out of their seats in the arena.
well, I mean, the fighting part of it is one that they really struggle with. That's absolutely right. And as I say often, I mean that as Sandhya knows better than all of us, is that a hit to the head from an elbow, from a shoulder, from a hip, from a stick, or from a fist, the brain doesn't distinguish. The brain doesn't say, oh, well, those other ones are kind of okay, but the fist, not so much. No, I mean, a hit to the head with a fist is like a hit to the head with an elbow. And yet, hockey has decided that of all of the sports, and I don't think there's any other, non-martial arts sport that allows fighting to happen. It penalizes it, but it allows it to happen. And that, I think, is the NHL's big obstacle. But to me, that's not where the most significant injuries happen. They happen in the regular action. The fights don't happen that often. And they happen less often, although this year they seem to be more frequent than they have been in some recent years.
A little bit, yes.
But it's the rest of the game where there are significant answers for that, I think. And
let me get Sandhya just to bring your expertise to bear here, because I think a lot of people remember when Sidney Crosby was almost accidentally bumped by a player back checking. The two of them didn't even see each other, and it looked like a very innocent play. And arguably one of the greatest players of all time was out for a whole year, and it was really problematic. Of course, back in Ken's day, players got concussions all the time, and they were out there. They didn't miss a game. They were afraid to lose their jobs, and they were right back on the ice. Can you give us some sense about the amount of time required to recover from a concussed brain?
That's a really good question. I would start by saying that it's true what Ken was saying in terms of it can be a blow to the body that has a whiplash effect to the head, or a blow directly to the head that could cause a concussion. And from there, it kind of depends on the individual, because it's a very individualized injury. And this is part of also why there's a lot of confusion around it, I think. And it's an invisible injury. You don't see it the same way as a broken arm, for example. And different people can experience it in different ways. The same person can experience a concussion differently if they've had a single concussion versus a next one and a next one as well. And so in general, you might see, a few weeks being the recovery period. But as I was mentioning before, 1 in 5 people will have a little bit of a longer, prolonged symptoms that they do see. Children might have a longer period of recovery as well. And the symptoms that you see can be different for different individuals too.
In your research, have you seen people who have literally only sustained, and I say only in inverted commas, but have only sustained one concussion, but it has lifelong implications?
I've certainly seen people who've had a single concussion, and at least from the time that they've had their concussion up till now, have had symptoms the entire time. There are certain things that we can do to try and bring that down and help the person modify their activity so that they're not triggering those symptoms and kind of learn to live around that. Exercise, for example, is a really good one, and different strategies that one can put to use there. But that it really depends. It's a very individualized thing.
And
I think
Steve,
that's important to. I think one thing that's important to point out here, and I know much of the conversation has been about hockey. But to me, football is more of my area of expertise and my background. We watch games and we see the big hit. We see the big hit, a safety coming down, a linebacker coming down, and the knockout hit. As vicious as those are, let's remember that in football, at a grassroots level, these kids are beginning at the ages of 8 and 9 in Pop Warner and minor football. And that in every practice, at every snap, there is a collision at the line of scrimmage where 5 offensive linemen and 4 defensive linemen, their heads bang. over and over and over and over repetitively. So while we watch on Friday nights or Saturday afternoons or Sunday afternoons, we watch the game, let's remember that in practices, in the preparation, there is so much of a repeated blow to the head over and over and over again. And I remember speaking with an offensive lineman about this, who was at the end of his career, and he was terrified. He was terrified of what is going to happen to him, not tomorrow or the next day or the day after, but he was sitting there wondering, when my kids are going to graduate from high school, what is my brain going to be mush? He said towards the end of his career, he got benched because for a couple of weeks, he tried to not lead with his head. Just in a regular snap, in a regular practice. He tried to protect himself. That's not the technique. That's not the way you're going to get, that's not the way you can play. And I think it's important to understand that in football, you cannot make football safe. You may try to make it safer. You cannot make it safe.
But I think that is a central point in all of these things. This is, we are way beyond awareness of the problem and way beyond the inherent nature of games and stuff. Yes. Now we get to the point of this is about awareness in terms of actions taken. And so in terms of the Pop Warner football coach, that Pop Warner football coach, is coaching the way he was coached when he was a kid. You go out and you do blocking practice and tackling practice, and is that the only way of practicing your game? Absolutely not. I mean, there are all kinds of, and in fact, I think Pop Warner and some of the other football, kids football leagues now, they've pushed, contact to an older age. There are ways of instead of throwing up our hands again and saying, look, this is just the nature of things. Not good enough anymore. That who are the decision makers and what, and it is in their hands to make those decisions. It's not in a scientist's hands. Sandhya can't do it. Sandhya can offer all kinds of information to us, but she is not the decision maker. Arash in his commentaries, or me in mine, we can't do it. It's the decision makers that make these kinds of decisions that can change a game. Coaches, individual coaches can change how they practice and how they play, but more significantly, leagues can. I mean, one of the conversations I've had in the last year or so is that there was a kind of Sport Canada conference involving all kinds of different leaders in their particular sports. And so, the question was for them, no, don't tell me anymore about what's wrong. It's in your hands. You can actually change the rules. You can make, that in changing the rules, you can have your coaches prepare your players to do it differently. And so you're not going to eliminate all brain injuries, but you can cut the number really significantly in this. And again, I mean, and it's what Sandhya was talking about earlier on, and about Paul Correa, is that here you've got this what happens when you have a series of blows to your knee. I mean, over time, you lose a little bit of speed, you lose a little bit of dexterity. That you aren't quite so fabulous as you were 2 years ago, as you were 3 years ago. And you can say, well, it's age. Well, yes, but you have been aged by these kinds of injuries. That's what happens with the brain too. And that Paul Correa, went on playing, after Paul Correa was not the same hockey player afterwards. He couldn't be Paul Correa on the ice anymore. Eric Lindros continued playing. He wasn't Eric Lindros anymore on the ice. You get diminished. You go from being a superstar to being a star to being, one hopes will become a star again, and all the rest of it until you're out of the game. That's not funny. That's not nice. You know, and it is in the hand. I mean, at that particular conference, you know, with those coaches, one of the best people there on it, and I thought he'd be the worst, was the guy who was involved with Football Canada. He was really interesting. And the second, you know, another guy there, Rugby Canada. They know they've got a problem. And they know that kids have 100 choices that they can make. You know, 30 of them are other sports. And so why play football? Why play rugby? Why not do some other sport? And they've had to, you know, really focus. Among the worst there, and I would say actually the worst there, Hockey Canada. You know, they were there sort of explaining away and sort of being the establishment and being, you know, this wise counsel. And after all, we're the biggest game in the country and all of this, and these things happen. And yes, we're going to do a little of this and a little bit of that. Garbage. You know, you've got this game in your hands. Make the right decision.
And Arash, can I get in here with a question for you?
Sure.
I want, because I do want to talk about the role of the media in all this. And I suppose, like many Canadians, I start every day watching the highlights from last night. I got one of those sports channels on, usually yours. And
good choice.
How much culpability do you think sports broadcasters have to take in glamorizing all of this, when much of the highlights, maybe not much, some of the highlights we see every morning are announcers just reveling in some of the, you know, absolutely intense and sometimes over the top violence that we see the night before?
I think it's part of it. I think it has improved in the last 10 years. We have now discovered that water does not actually make us weak. We have understood that these are significant injuries. Part of sport is still that primal rage, that it's still about the gladiators out there. I do think there is a responsibility, but I do think it's changed a little bit from a culture standpoint in how it has been presented. Maybe that's just my opinion, because I got introduced to this topic back in 2004. But Steve, you are not wrong in that assessment. I just wanted to add a couple of things that follow up on what Ken said when he spoke about the knees. I remember speaking with a team doctor years ago. He said there's two things you don't mess with. You don't mess with the brain, and you don't mess with the heart. You can go get a knee replacement. You can go get a hip replacement. They can put screws in your elbow. They can't go replace your brain, and they can't go replace your heart. Those are two things. The other is on the football side and the young people. There is going to be a ban beginning January of 2022 for any Canadian kid under 12 to play 12-on-12 tackle football. No longer can any kid under the age of 12 play 12-on-12 tackle football in this country beginning January 1st. What's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is participation in flag football. Yeah, what you played in junior high out there in gym class. The numbers in flag football have increased significantly. And COVID has actually helped it, because you're not in locker rooms, you're not putting on pads, you're outdoors. I have some numbers. Now, this goes back to 2018. We just don't have updated ones because of the pandemic. But flag football among males and females, 26,000 males in 2018 played flag, 15,000 females compared to 79,000 with tackle. Now, 2020, under 18, this is for the under 18 group, registered were 28,000 players playing football in 2020. Again, it's a pandemic year. 80% non-contact. Registered for the spring of 2021, 90% are registered in flag. That means no helmets. That means no pads. That means no tackling. There'll probably be a little bit of contact, but probably not head-to-head contact when you're not wearing that armor. So
basically, the parents deciding they don't want their kids to be cannon fodder anymore.
And that is the fear that professional football leagues had. Mom doesn't want their kid playing football anymore. We better pivot, and we better pivot fast, or our sport may not exist.
Sandhya, can you talk to us about what's happening right now for those who have been concussed and who are trying to recover? Are we making, in terms of your research, in terms of what's going on out there, are we making enough progress that these people can have a second shot at a good life?
I think there's definitely progress, especially over the decade or so that I've been in the field. I've certainly seen some progress. I personally have been involved in policy. So my sister and I were able to help develop a national piece of policy that we were hoping to put in place. And more recently, we were able to go to Parliament and testify around the things that we wanted to see put in place. So that would be like a National Concussion Awareness Week, a very detailed national strategy to address concussions across the board, because we're talking about sport here today, but it actually happens in so many different contexts, in the workplace, at home, on the playground, and so on. But there's still a lot of things that do need to be done. And there is policy in Ontario. Some of our research was able to inform that as well. So that's been a very interesting process. And something called Rowan's Law exists in Ontario. It's a very sad situation where Rowan Stringer, who is a secondary student, died because of multiple unmanaged concussions. And one of the reasons I think policy is so important is because it can act as sort of a recipe to know what to do when a situation occurs. So, for example, when somebody gets a concussion, what do you do? The word concussion and the notion of concussion has certainly increased in terms of awareness and so on in the past few years, but there certainly are still people who aren't exactly sure what to do or just don't follow those rules. And having something like that in place makes it more of a mandatory thing that they would have to follow. So unfortunately, Rowan Stringer passed away after that situation, and this policy was put in place. Her father, Gordon Stringer, did a lot of work on that as well, and it actually makes it mandatory for sport organizations in Ontario as well as school boards to have return to play protocols, removal from play protocols when they suspect a concussion. These organizations also need to yearly have some sort of review of existing concussion awareness resources and confirm that they're aware of that. And they also have to have something called a code of conduct, which I personally think could be very useful for potentially pro organizations as well, and not just amateur organizations, and something that can help change the culture of sport. I think it would take a long time potentially to change the culture of sport, but something that we definitely need to work on now. Something that Ken mentioned earlier, focusing on the victim, the person who is concussed, is something that maybe is not a bigger part of the picture right now. And I fully agree is something we do need to focus on, because it's something that affects that person's life in sport, but also outside of sport. And when they're a pro athlete, especially, it's part of their identity as a human being that they are an athlete. So that's taken away from them. And it also affects their family and caregivers as well.
Let me pick up on that code of conduct and go to Ken on that. And I'm not looking for you, Ken, to pick a fight with George Peros, but I'm intrigued about your thoughts about him. George Peros is, as you point out, the head of player safety for the NHL right now. For those who don't know his name, George was a seriously tough customer when he played in the NHL. He spent a lot of his career in the penalty box. He no doubt has sustained numerous concussions from all the fights he got into, but he probably gave a lot of concussions to other people as well. Do you think he's the right guy to ensure player safety today?
I think that George Peros is not the decision maker. He's the day-to-day guy who decides things, but really, for any kind of significant impact, it's from the league, and that league, the NHL, the central figure, the power in the league is Gary Bettman, and he's been the commissioner since 1993, and through a lot of ups and downs in the early years, or he had a lot of ups and downs in the early years, but he since they won the lockout in 2005 and got the salary cap, he has been the voice in terms of what happens in the NHL. So it isn't George Peros, and the thing that, and just to go back just quickly to what Sandhya was saying, is that the danger of, I mean, there are clearly things that can be done, protocols, better treatments, and all the rest of it. There is not one doctor in the world, I'm sure, that would say that there are the kinds of treatments and protocols that are going to return somebody to where they were before. The question really, it's about prevention. I mean, one of the things, I love going to scientific conferences. I have been to lots of scientific conferences. They are really interesting. And the work that Sandhya and others do, fantastic, and with a great impact. The thing is that what they do is after the fact. It is diagnosing somebody who has been injured. It is treating somebody who has been injured. It is return to play of somebody who has been injured. The question is that how do you prevent, a significant number of the injuries? That is the real, and that is in the hands of the sport decision makers. It isn't in the scientists' hands or in the media's hands. And so not, as the good things that are happening in terms of legislation, policy, science, research, and the rest of it, understand that all of those things are after the fact actions, not before, that would prevent the actions from happening.
Let me just remind anybody watching.
Sandhya, if you want to make a lot of money, I will challenge you to make a cast for the head. Because we talk about culture and we talk about, look, in a collision sport, we can try prevention all we want, but it's going to happen. I think what we've learned with brain damage in sport is that one brain injury plus one does not equal two. The second one can actually be worse for you. So, Sandhya, I say make a cast for the head because if I'm concussed in game 2 or 3 of a playoff series, and I walk into the locker room the day before game 6, and my team's down 3-2, the guy beside me in the locker room is looking at me and saying, "Hey, man, you look pretty good, and we need you tomorrow." I know I'm not right. I have a serious. I didn't sleep last night. I'm seeing stars. I'm having issues. The inherent pressures in the locker room to return to play. The coaches who will say things to you, that's a problem too. If somebody walks in on crutches, if somebody walks in with a sling, they're almost forgotten about into the shadows. But that is a part of this Can I understand? Prevention's a big part of it.
No, Arash, I think you are right to a point and wrong fundamentally. That you're right to the point of where players play, and players are always going to play. They want to play. They love to play. It's part of the test of playing when you're injured. It's part of what you want to do for your teammates, for your fans, for your coaches, for everybody else. You love the feeling of going out and playing no matter what the circumstances are. Now, if you're a decision maker, that is the great thing if you're a player, and it's a great quality to have in a player. But what you need is that everybody needs somebody else, a writer needs an editor, somebody else, needs a producer or a director. You need another set of eyes and ears to say at some point, Arash, not tonight. Not tonight. I know you want to play. I know your teammates want you to play. But I, as the coach, I, as the general manager, I, as the league, I, as the team doctor, I know the pressures of all of that. I know that that the instinct is, well, maybe the guy's okay and let him go out and play because he really wants to play. That's why it is crucial for those who are the central decision makers to decide, to stand up and decide, to understand that they have in their hands the futures of those players that they're dealing with, that they love to call the family. We're all a family here. This team is a family. There's nothing like fill in the blank name of the team, family. Is this how you treat family members? Is this how you do it? And if you're a media person, then why don't you at a certain point say, Like that hit to the head, that Tom Wilson delivered, that was really stupid. That was really unnecessary. He could have made exactly the play he needed to make, and without two huge consequences. One, that he's now out of the lineup for 7 games. And the other is Brendan Carlo, who could have been me or you or anybody else, has their future in some doubt or more than some doubt. So why don't you, as the media person, at that moment say, as part of the commentary, I like good, tough hockey. I like this and that. That was stupid. That was a hit to the head. He didn't have to do that. That puts at risk somebody who doesn't deserve to be at risk.
Arash, I'm not sure I heard one commentator say that on the morning highlights after the Wilson Carlo hit.
No, I understand that. And I think that I can only speak for myself. I know where my thoughts are on it. I don't think there are a lot of people fully educated on this or care. Or maybe they are, but then when push comes to shove and the lights come on, the adrenaline is going, revert back to the dinosaur era.
Yeah, it's not enough.
Let me just jump in here. We're less than 10 minutes to go here, and I just want to put out the question or put out the reminder that if anybody has any questions, you can put them into the chat function, and our engineer Matt will get them up on the screen here. And I see Natalie DeRosier, who's the principal at Massey College, has already got a question in here. Is the image, she asks, of the gladiator really archaic? Is that rooted in a male psychology that wants to hurt? Okay, who wants in on that one?
Well, I'll just tell you this. UFC has succeeded for how long now? Which is effectively exactly that, guys.
UFC is gladiatorial combat today, for sure.
Now, does that mean that Connor McDavid is any less a gladiator? Or Sidney Crosby? Or Wayne Gretzky? Or any Bobby Orr? Or any name you want to mention? Are they less gladiators than Tom Wilson? Than somebody else? I don't think so. There's lots of ways to be a gladiator. I mean, I played on a team of gladiators. And the way they were gladiators, they checked like crazy. They shot like crazy. They scored like crazy. That's how they were gladiators. There are more than one definition of what a gladiator is.
I agree. I think we need to. Sorry, Steve, were you gonna?
No, please go ahead, Sandhya.
Okay, thanks. I was gonna say, I think we need to reframe how we look at things, even from a fan perspective and from the media perspective as well, in terms of what sort of things are we normalizing, what sort of behaviors are we normalizing, what sort of things is there demand for, like you were mentioning, Steve, in terms of those lists and highlight reels of hits and violent behavior. If there's demand for that, then that's obviously going to continue. We're monetizing and commodifying athletes without looking at the other side of things, at them as people, as humans, at the health side of things. How do we frame science when we're looking at sport in the media? Do we even look at that at all? Do we need to do a better job? I think we can. And then even looking at who's presenting this highlight reels of hits and violent behavior. If there's demand for that, then that's obviously going to continue. We're monetizing and athletes.
You've developed a talent for ventriloquism, apparently. That was really quite something right there. Can we sneak another question in here, Matt? Let's see. Okay, we've got another question coming in. This is from David Rosen. David says, what about players like Wilson? How about self-discipline, mutual respect? Ken's book, Game Change, illustrated deterioration of the person Steve Montador. Don't players care? Ken, I remember we had you on the agenda talking about your Steve Montador book. That was a fantastic look at a young man whose life ended because of too many headshots. Don't the players care or respect each other enough not to end their careers in this way? Coming in, this is from David.
Yeah, I think to an increased extent they do, and again, it's like when do those hits happen? Who delivers them? And the vast majority of players do not deliver them. They do not do really stupid stuff. And the one thing, Steve, that I remember when I was writing, I don't know whether it was the Steve Montador book or the Scotty Bowman book, but of looking at highlight reels in the morning. And it's really interesting. There are not an awful lot of highlight reel stuff that is fight, and it's almost all goals. I mean, it's one great play, and then it's the next great play, and then, oh my God, there's a play that's even greater than the last one. And if you go out and watch kids hockey now, I mean, the age of contact has gone up, but who are those kids dreaming of being? Do they dream of being Tom Wilson? I don't think so. In their imaginations and down in their basements, out in the driveway, out in the practice ice, what are they doing out there? They're making up the next unbelievable play that they saw on the highlights in the morning, and that they think they can add a little wrinkle to it that is their own. That's the nature of where things are now. That the game has changed. It's the NHL, and at a certain level, that has not changed. I mean, one of the things that I talked about in the book is that Gary Bettman was smart enough when he started, because he had never played the game, to surround himself with people who had played the game. The problem is that they never played this game. They played a game that was played decades ago, and that game is gone. It's not played out, there any longer. That's not where the focus is. Are there summer camps and special clinics that are for, the big hit and this and that? No, those special camps and clinics. I mean, I watch our grandkids play hockey. It's unbelievable, the level of talent and skill. The biggest problem, that the leagues don't focus on in connecting that to brain injuries, is that now, in order to succeed, you not only have to be able to skate like crazy and have to be able to manipulate your hands like crazy, but your mind has to work like crazy. You have to have the full capacity of your knees, the full capacity of your shoulders and your hands, and the full capacity of your brain, or you can't play this game. You're going to go from this level down to another, level in it. That's the nature of it. So make your judgments relative to what the nature of the game is, and the nature of the game and the direction of that game. Not the game that is in your imagination, my imagination. That game isn't there on the ice anymore.
Matt, let's sneak in one last question if we can here. This is from somebody who identifies herself as Shipper713. Arash, I've heard you say that you hate football 6 out of 7 days of the week. I am sure you're not alone in this sentiment. What does the future of the game look like with this in mind?
Yeah, and what I mean by that is football drives me nuts 6 out of the 7 days a week. And yet on Sundays, there I am glued, morning, afternoon, and night. Because the game, as Ken said, the game is so pure. The game is played when it's played at a high level, it is so wonderful. It is just incredible to watch. And then the injury reports come out, and then you see what you see, and the underbelly of it. I just go back to LeBron played high school football, and he said there is no chance I'm going to let my kids play football. And people asked him, they said, well, aren't you being a hypocrite about this? And LeBron said, no. He said, my kids aren't growing up in poverty. That's why I played. It was my chance to get out. And when you think about the success of college football in the United States and how big of a business it is, so the biggest conference is the SEC. The Southeastern Conference is Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. So much of that is rooted with kids in poverty just looking for a chance at a scholarship, a chance at the pros, a chance to get out of their situation. You watch the game, it can be played well, and then one of those ugly hits happen. One of those needless hits happen. And you wonder yourself, as Ken has said, as Sandhya has pointed out, why? Why is this continuing to happen when we know as much as we do? We go to convenience stores, we still see cigarettes being sold. We all know how bad it is, but they continue to be sold. And it was in front of Congress that Roger Goodell was accused by somebody there, congressperson, saying you're basically modern day tobacco when you were hiding, the effects that football can have on the brain. Now, that was 10 years ago. We now know what it is. And so 6 days of the week, it drives me nuts, but yet there I am on Sunday, my butt's fastened to the couch, watching what's happening out there.
I want to give the last minute we have here to Ken Dryden to sum up with this. Ken, I know you have written numerous pieces about this for newspapers. You've written articles for magazines. You've written great books about this subject. I'm sure Gary Bettman is aware of your views on this. Have you had a chance to directly communicate with him on it? And if so, what's his response been?
No, I haven't. I mean, the first copy of Game Change, the book about Steve Montador, I gave to him. We had a lunch in New York, and it was about a month before the book came out officially, and I wanted to make sure that I've known Gary for a long time, and we share a history at Cornell University. We weren't there at the same time, but we have an affection for the university. I enjoyed working with Gary a lot when I was with the Leafs, and he was the commissioner of the NHL. And I really, as I said, I really enjoyed working with him. And he's been the right guy to do the right thing, and he hasn't done the right thing. And the question is that you can fold up your tent and decide, well, that decision maker is not going to do the right thing, and move on, or no, I'm sorry, that this is too consequential. And so if he and the NHL are going to continue to do the wrong thing, then people should understand that they're doing the wrong thing, and make it clear. And the thing that begins to happen over time, and one of the really revealing things, and I was involved to some extent in terms of the parliamentary subcommittee that was created, a year, probably, I guess it's 2 years ago now, on brain injuries and concussions in sports. And I knew that if that was created, Gary Bettman would need to be invited. And if he needed to be invited, he couldn't say no. And if he couldn't say no, then all of a sudden he is there in front of a group where he's going to be, that he's not going to be able to cut off questions in 30 seconds. Or a minute, or wait for the journalist to go on to some other topic. He's going to have to fill time, and then once time gets filled, then you start to reveal yourself in terms of what it is you really think and what you really believe, and does that pass muster? And the thing that was so terrific, in turn, it was so revealing. It's like, is this actually what you think? I mean, after this period of time, after all of these things that have come out, after being able to be prepared on this for years, and this is the best answer you can come up with? Holy man, this is actually more serious than I thought. So, and I think that, that some of the commentators are doing better. Some of the commentators will say, and it's actually most, I think now, will say when there's a big hit, was that a head hit? Was that a head hit? They're really very much more sensitive now to the fact of whether it is a hit or a head hit. That is some progress. And the risk of decision makers that Gary Bettman, that what he faces is the same as the tobacco decision makers, that for years and years they offered their answers. The public wasn't sure. The public was ambivalent. And then finally, at a certain point, the public said, actually, I know now. I have an opinion, that smoking causes cancer. Cancer is a bad thing. Smoking is a bad thing. And they went on, and kept defending, tobacco. And what happened is that they started to look like idiots. And the same, happened in terms of opioids. Same thing. And then all of a sudden, the public understands And now the people who are supporting that or defending that, they look like idiots. That is the risk that you face if you are Gary Bettman or others, is that the public leaves you behind and they just look and they say, I'm not listening to that anymore. I know how significant brain injuries are and what they do to people. It's not nice. There are things that can be done to change it. You're not taking it. I'm not listening to you anymore.
And that is our last word tonight. Ken Dryden, Arash Madani, Sandhya Mylabathula, really good of you to spend so much time on behalf of Massey College for this discussion tonight. I'm Steve Paikin. Thank you and good night, everyone.
Good night.